Thank you, everybody. Take a seat. Thank you. We have a very special guest tonight. Last time I was up here, you might remember, we had Dennis Prager. We had a lot of fun. But I opened by reflecting on my mostly peaceful visit to University of California, Davis. And I want to talk about another thing that Turning Point USA has been involved in the last week and a half, 2 weeks. Very important. And unfortunately, it's a pattern that we are seeing. And so it shouldn't be controversial to say that men should not be able to compete in women's sports. That shouldn't be controversial, that you have female sports and you have male sports, that God created man and God created woman. Why is this even something that is considered to be controversial? Well, we're living in a postmodern age where truth really means nothing, as Christianity has declined in the public sphere and declined in our government. And so there's a really courageous individual that we have started working with at Turning Point USA. Her name is Riley Gaines. Many of you probably know who she is, right? We should have her at a Freedom Night. That would actually be really fun, wouldn't it? That'd be great. And Riley has a very interesting story. She wanted to be a national champion swimmer. She was all SEC, all American. She very well might have been a national champion swimmer, but she was unable to win the national championship, not because she got hurt or she actually broke her personal record, but instead a man won the national championship competing in the female division. Now, this is an interesting question, isn't it? Because I hear from Christians sometimes, well, Charlie, it's not very loving to say that men should not compete in female sports. No, this is something that a lot of Christian pastors are saying now, a fair amount, which it's very interesting. I must have missed the Bible verse where it said we must tolerate evil. We should never tolerate evil as Christians, and we should never tolerate insanity. So Riley Gaines did not end up winning the national championship. She had to share the stage in the medal ceremony as Thomas, the biological man who thinks he is a woman, incorrectly thinks he is a woman. And that's not even the big problem here. The problem is he wants everyone else to think he's a woman. That's the issue. You see, they present it as, well, Charlie, how does that impact you? Well, it really doesn't when somebody has an out-of-control imagination or a misguided delusion. It doesn't impact you. It impacts you if you want me to go along with your delusion. Or you're going to force me to go along with your delusion. Or you're going to force women to not be able to win championships because of your delusion. Then it absolutely impacts me. And that's really the issue at hand here, isn't it? And so there's other parts of the story that I think are worthy. It's interestingly, some of the outrage that happened when I visited UC Davis when they tried to burn the campus down actually was rooted in an interview I had with Riley Gaines. So there's a lot of intersection points here, but the reason I got fired up in that interview is Riley Gaines also mentioned that when she was competing in the NCAA championship that Thomas, the biological male, exposed himself to the women in the locker room. I don't know if you heard the story or not. We used to call those people perverts, and we probably still should, quite honestly, because women should not have to be exposed to that. Okay, so all of that is important, and we should talk about it, but that's actually not the main thing I want to share with you today. The main thing I want to share with you is how we as Christians need to understand the clear and present danger that the ideology that transgenderism presents to decency and modern life. Now, I'm being very precise with my words. Are there nice people that are under the transgender delusion? Of course. They're all made in the image of God, and they deserve help and compassionate care, which, by the way, is not chopping off their genitals at age 13 and putting them on Lupron and antidepressants. That's not compassionate or caring for anybody. But this is a very serious issue, and it's not going away. And it's not something I take joy in. It's not something I want to share with you with delight, but we have to pinpoint this because the media refuses to talk about it. Because they make it seem as if, oh, you're intolerant if you dare say anything about this. You're hateful, you're bigoted. Okay, let's just go through the facts, okay? There was a Christian school that was targeted as a hate crime, and 3 kids and 3 adults were killed by a transgender individual that was likely under a delusion of anti-Christian hate by this transgender ideology, okay? We haven't seen the manifesto. This is largely speculation, but we do know the essence of what she believed as her worldview. There was another shooting that you might not have heard about that thankfully was thwarted in Colorado Springs of another transgender individual that wanted to shoot up Christian schools. Thankfully, the police were able to intervene and, praise God, arrest that person. I could go through other examples as well that I think are important. But this kind of violence and intimidation all of a sudden showed up at a Turning Point USA chapter event at San Francisco State University. Now, I know some of you might say, Charlie, what are you guys doing events at San Francisco State University? Why are you doing events at UC Davis and all this? If you ask that question, I mean this lovingly, you are the problem. If I am the issue for trying to have someone who should have been an NCAA swim champion to go talk about female sports with a liberal environment, and I get accused of provocation, you're the problem. You should be able to speak on any American college campus about decent and agreeable topics. You should not have to silence yourself because people are going to act in a certain way. Okay, so last Thursday, 6 nights ago, Riley Gaines shows up at San Francisco State University to go give a speech in kind of a classroom setting. It was 100 people. Many of you probably saw the footage. It's worthy of exploring it, but there's part of it you probably don't know, honestly, that I'm going to share with you that I think is really important. So she shows up, she gives a speech, and of course she starts to get interrupted. She starts to get harassed. She gets assaulted, and then she was basically pseudo-kidnapped by these trans activists. Not an exaggeration. These people stood outside of the room she was in, threatening more physical force and intimidation, saying, pay us and we'll go away, saying that we want you to miss your flight, of which she did miss her flight, but I mean that worse things can happen, obviously. I'm going to play a short news clip for those of you unfamiliar with it, and then I'm going to tell you how the university responded to this. Because this is almost terrorism, isn't it? I mean, they're holding someone hostage, they're assaulting them, they're targeting them based on their beliefs. Play this short clip from the great Tucker Carlson with Riley Gaines.
Gaines went to San Francisco State University to talk about her experiences in NCAA swimming. And Riley Gaines is not a hater. She is a measured, decent person who believes in logic and reason and finding common ground with people who disagree with her. She does not think she is God. But that fact, that she does not believe she's God, makes her a terrifying threat to the zealots who do believe they're God. And so at San Francisco State last night, the zealots attacked her. A mob surrounded Riley Gaines and prevented her from moving through the hallways. At one point, the thugs said they wouldn't let her pass unless she paid the money. During the chaos, a man dressed as a woman punched her several times. The mob howled with rage, screaming threats and obscenities. We're not overstating. Here's what it looked like.
I'm good. I'm coming. I'm good. Trust me, I'm good. Go ahead.
This is demonic. We need to call it what it is. And so the university responded. The vice president of diversity of student affairs praised those protesters as thanking them for being peaceful. Said that Riley Gaines was spreading hate on campus. These are people that are paid by taxpayers that are in charge of your children when you send them to campus, college campus. Said that there was too much security, so that agitated them. And said that this was a proud moment for the university because the students acted against hate, kidnapping a guest speaker and using violence. And it wasn't just one, it was several administration that released, and they said for any of the students that now need counseling services for the damage that you had to experience, it's now available, and if you need to take off class, you can do so. So what's really going on here? This is not about trans anything. We can have that conversation. I certainly have strong and heated opinions here. No, this for Christians, this is a wake-up call. It should be, if you're not awake to this issue. The T in LGBT stands for tyranny. They're going to force you to believe this stuff, or they're going to pseudo-kidnap you. They're going to intimidate you. This is not live and let live. This is live and let us rule. I get sometimes people email me, oh, Charlie, come on, why do you have to talk about this issue? Just leave them alone. We have left them alone. They're not leaving us alone. That's the issue. Is that they're now coming towards our institutions. She was there to talk about female sports. Riley Gaines never did anything towards a trans person. A trans person came into her athletic competition and robbed her of a national championship. So how do we respond to this? We're going to explore that deeper topic tonight. But I do want to make sure, and I'm sure you all agree at this, but where is the church on this? Broadly. How many pastors are speaking out about, do you think less than 90% or more than 90% of pastors in the last couple weeks told their congregation that there was a Christian hate crime committed by someone who thought they were transgender? I think less than probably 5% of pastors probably mentioned something. Isn't that interesting? So we are living through times where people know something is wrong, where there is a violent ideology that is growing, and it is not isolated, by the way. It is in our kids' classrooms, it's on social media, and now we are seeing actual carnage because of it. And decent people need to stand up against it. Turning Point USA is probably the most targeted organization right now in America. The amount of death threats, that was at a Turning Point USA chapter meeting, the stuff we have to deal with. And honestly, that shows that we're doing what we need to be doing. And when you guys show up to this event, when you support Dream City, when you guys support Turning Point USA, that is what we do. We show up to places of people that don't always agree with us, and we are going to stand for truth. And honestly, God bless Riley Gaines. You know why? Because she's back on campus tomorrow at the University of Albany, other side of the country, where she has numerous death threats. She has forced intimidation. We're going to smash your head in. We're going to kill you. We're going to cut your head off. Campus security doing almost nothing. But guess what? She's going to show up standing for truth and with courage. For those of you that say, Charlie, I don't know if I can stand up to my boss. I don't know if I can tell my aunt. How about this? Draw some inspiration from the Turning Point USA students that literally put their lives on the line to fight for truth every day. With that, let's welcome our guest, the great Bob McEwen. Come on up.
All righty.
Former congressman, president of the Council of National Policy. We're going to have a great conversation. Come on up.
Thank you very much.
The slides are ready if you want them, or we could just wait.
Yeah, well,
Mr. McEwen, welcome to Phoenix.
I am honored to be here, and the scripture says to not withhold honor from whom honor is due. We are all here because you're here, and we're grateful for that.
And thanks does go to the amazing Teep USA Faith team. I don't know if you know this, but in addition to everything we're doing at Turning Point USA, we're currently helping with and partnering with Sean Feucht in a 50-state state capital revival tour. And many of you remember Sean here, so they're doing a great job and really proud of the work that they're doing.
And for this church to open up like this.
And it just needs to be said every time we gather, if this is not your home church, you should reconsider. I mean that. This should be your home church. Because, maybe there's another church locally. There's a couple, and we have the pastors here, and we get to know them, but that are standing boldly and courageously. But I'm not going to say any names of some of these local churches, but I meet these people. They say, oh, I really wish my pastor would say something. And you know what I always say? I wish you would leave that church and go to a pastor that is saying something. Because, how much more time do you need? Anyway, that's a separate issue. Might be a little harsh, but I'm sure, whatever. Welcome.
Well, I'm delighted to be here.
So any immediate thoughts on this trans issue? Because, you've seen a lot. You have a lot of wisdom to share.
Well, it's if you were to ask me what's the most important thing I've ever learned in my entire life, it would be this, that everything in life is either physical or spiritual. And wisdom is the capacity to tell which is which. And so if you think, for example, if I have enough physical relationships, I'll find love. No, the fruit of the Spirit is love. So love is spiritual. Love, joy. If I just have a new car, get in a boat, have my own business, then I'll be happy. No, happiness is spiritual. Peace, physical, they think if I just smoke this, man, I'll be at peace. No, peace is not physical. So in this, let's just take money, for example. If I put a $1 bill, $10 bill, $100 bill, physically they're all the same. So money is spiritual, and America is spiritual. You and I can't become Japanese or Chinese, but anybody can become an American, because American is spiritual. It stands for righteousness in the world. Therefore, this battle is a spiritual battle. And to where does a leader go that understands on a school board or a city council and they know something's not right? Where do they go to the editorial board, or do they go to the faculty at the college? They would like to go to the church, and for too long, the church has allowed this nation to float and has missed those opportunities. And quite frankly, I am excited at the moment because I believe, as you've heard me say, that we're now awakening to the battle. You say, oh, this is terrible. Look what's happening. Well, we've been drifting here for a long time, and finally, now we're starting to wake up. And through leadership such as yours on college campuses around the country, I am optimistic that God's not dead yet.
So then we could talk about so many different things. Let's start with this one. Why should Christians care about these issues? So some objections I heard. Recently we got an email. Charlie, the trans thing is fine. Not fine, but I don't like it. But, Jesus is coming soon. And in fact, he's coming next Thursday. Why should I even care about this issue at all?
Can I just take a moment to talk about America? We say things like, this is a great country and it's a wonderful, but why? Let me just tell you, it's not only a good country, there's no country like this ever in the history of mankind. Let's just walk through it a little bit. Economically, half the world lives on less than $2 a day. The second richest spot on earth is Western Europe, France, Germany, Britain. There's a thing called the Richter study. It's done every 18 months. A person living in poverty in America is more likely to have a telephone, a television, an air conditioner, an automobile, eats more meat, has more square footage space than the average resident of the second richest spot on earth, Western Europe. Now, Americans, only 4% of the world call themselves Americans. And yet, every year, those 4% write more books, more plays, symphonies, copyrights, more inventions than the other 96% combined. For thousands of years, people would hope to someday fly. Americans invented the airplane and the light bulb. Let's just take the airplane. The tires on the airplane, the vulcanization process was created by Charles Goodyear from Akron, Ohio. And then the lights on there, the air conditioner, Willis Carrier, the airplane that the entire world uses, this nation has blessed the world as no other nation has. Last year, over 300 times, ships were attacked on the high seas. If you're attacked on the high seas, to whom can you appeal for help? Whether it be a yacht in the Mediterranean or a British trawler in the Straits of Hormuz. Only the 327,000 Americans wear the uniform of the United States Navy. America is the standard for righteousness in the world. It not only economically, but politically. And so if 60 to 70% of all of maritime traffic goes up through the South China Sea, the South China Sea is protected by Americans. So the world is stable because of this great country. The rest of the world is dependent upon it. Scripture says if you take a city, must bind a strong man. There's only one strong man in the world. If you take America down, the rest of it is a piece of cake. Therefore, in this battle, it's been entrusted to us. And this country is very young. You all know somebody 80 years old. 3 times 80 is 240. It was 80 years from Washington to Lincoln, 80 years from Lincoln to Roosevelt, 80 years from Roosevelt to today. A person who's lived 80 years has lived a third of the history of the United States. This country has been entrusted to our generation, and we're not going to let it disappear. Now, the rest of the world is hoping and praying that we'll do the right thing, and I believe that, and let me just say 2 more things about that. Never in the history of man has one nation had the capacity to overrun another nation, but what it didn't do it. with the single exception of the United States of America after World War II. Prior to that time, whenever, that's why Churchill kept saying, Hitler, look at him. If he's allowed to get away with that, you let him go into Czechoslovakia, then he'll take Poland. If he takes Poland, he'll take France. Whenever a country tries to do that, the only time we've ever had peace is when there's stability. After World War II, the United States could have taken any nation in the world, and yet we didn't. No other nation has been like that, number one. Number two, never in the history of man has a nation shed blood and treasure for the freedom of another and never asked anything in return other than the United States of America. I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and we're talking to the folks in South Korea and mentioning how that the World War II veterans were passing away and how that the Korean veterans were bearing in their body the burden of having brought freedom. For what? So that those people could be free. But at the end of the Korean War, South Korea was third from the bottom, the third poorest nation on the planet. Today it's the 10th richest nation on the 10th largest GDP in the world. That's what America does for people. Now, if that is allowed to dissipate, if the Chinese are able to take over the South China Sea, as is the threat at the moment, because weakness invites aggression, then they can say to the Japanese, who the fourth largest economy in the world, if you want to send you import 100% of your oil has to come from the Middle East, there's going to be a 10, 15, 25% surcharge unless you break relations with Israel. Well, now Japan has to decide, are they going to impact that or they're going to be, the world hasn't seen in our generation what it's like to not have a righteous leader of the world, and that's America. We had built a canal in Panama. Every ship that showed up, they got in line. American ships got in line. There are military bases on both ends of the military canal, thanks to Jimmy Carter, that are controlled by the Chinese. Now, do you think the Chinese, given the opportunity, they can decide will that happen? All of this is at risk because of our nation is threatened, and we need to understand that when we say this is the greatest nation on earth, it's the greatest nation that ever has been. And let me just conclude by that. As I said, every year, more books, plays, symphony, copyrights, inventions. This nation has blessed the world, so unlike any other nation, when a tsunami hits the largest Muslim, hits Indonesia, who do they call? They call upon the grateful Americans that come to their aid. So that has now been lovingly handed to us. It's under threat, and because of what you're doing, Charlie, and because of what we want to stand behind you and support, I have every assurance that this nation will continue to prosper. And I'll tell you later on why.
So, explain in your how you would respond to a pastor who would say, that's all great, but I just do the gospel. My job as a church is not to get into any of that stuff. The gospel is important regardless of what happens to the nation. You might laugh at that. A majority of Christian pastors will say that. In fact, I'm talking to one tomorrow. Pray for me, not for him, okay? So pray for that I have the fruit of the Spirit of self-control, because I'm losing patience with these people. But you know, Bob, some of them say, look, I mean, we're just here for Jesus. We're here for the gospel. America is, some are anti-American, some are not social justice-y, but they're not moved by that, Bob, because what we have is a generation of pastors that could not care less about the nation that they are in.
Part of that is ignorance, and fear comes from a lack of knowledge. Knowledge drives away fear, and they don't understand why America is what it is. If you take all the money that goes for global evangelism from the entire planet, the 96%, and you increase it 5.5 times, that's still not as much as America gives. This is the lighthouse for the gospel. When they sweep out, I went through the countries in Central and Eastern Europe when they were leaving communism. They sweep out these churches and begin to have services for the first time. To whom do they ask for hymnals and for Bibles? They look to America. We started a prayer breakfast in Kiev in Ukraine. I've spoken at everyone for the last 8 years. And at the end, last year they were pleading, doesn't America understand? So the United States is the lighthouse for the gospel. There is no doubt about it. our dear pastor friends, Satan, by the way, is not stupid. He knows how to do this. And one of the things that he did about 40 years ago was to slip into the seminaries and to explain to them, to make it sound noble to do what is wrong. And so he says, you know, you need to understand that when you get up there in the pulpit, that these politicians are going to come in and they're going to try to get your eyes off of Christ. And you've got a greater calling. Your greatest calling is to win souls for the Lord. And so all these other people are going to try to turn your head, and you have to keep them at bay. And so our pastors, and we've done pastors' conferences for years, and we understand that they deliberately know how to let the air out of the tires because they have a misunderstanding of Scripture in that they think that they're not accountable. And so they say things like Romans 13, that we're supposed to submit. And he said, you saw those people on the ramp. They had those signs that were waving. They think that they have an impact as God sets up kings and takes down kings. Now, that's not correct. That's not correct, because under our system, we're accountable to God. It's entirely different from the way it was in the Old Testament. We're going to stand before God. It's been entrusted to us. And therefore, so when the pastor sits there and he tries to play this game, that he doesn't want to get involved in somehow or another, that's noble. There was a parable of the talents in which he said to a person who had the opportunity to do something and didn't, he said, you vile and worthless person. And the Lord said that, which wasn't very nice about what he said. He said, I gave you a tool and you didn't use it. Now, these pastors do not fully understand their responsibility politically. They don't understand how politics works. And so they are subject to the task of this other misunderstanding. That you go to a Christian school, and all the folks that were activists in the 1960s, the radical leftists, they cut their hair and now they wear suits. Most of them are bald now. And they come back and they go to and they say to these college kids, they say, you know, Jesus never talked about abortion. And Jesus never talked about gay marriage. But he had a lot to say about helping the poor. And you know, these right-wingers, they're always talking about abortion and homosexuality and things. Who do we want to be like? Do we want to be like Jesus, or do we want to be like these haters? Now, that sounds like it makes sense. So what I do is when I come back, I quote it exactly what they say. And then I take the scriptures and I say, fine. I don't need a book. I don't need a chapter. I'll take one verse anywhere. Wherever God ever called upon a politician to use the police power of the state to take from one person and give to another. He never did. You never get points from stealing from other people. Being like Jesus means living the way that he lived. Therefore, there were 471 times we're told to help the poor. The scriptures created 3 institutions: the church, the family, and the government. 2/3 of the time, the scripture says that the church should help the poor. Individuals should help the poor, you and me. 1/3 of the time, it says the church. And I'll take any verse ever that says where God ever called upon the government. He never did. So, in the understanding of these pastors, it's their responsibility to care about our environment, that is our neighborhood, and without their leadership, the nation will flounder, and that's where we are at the moment.
And it's also about developing the spiritual health of your flock to create disciples, not just converts. Because if you as a pastor are not communicating about these issues biblically, then somebody else is going to fill the void, and they're not going to do it from a biblical worldview. And this is something I have found. And this, you know, I ask pastors that don't talk about this, I say, well, okay, your congregation is going to end up making political conclusions eventually. Wouldn't you want them to be doing it through a prism of a biblical worldview? Wouldn't you want them to be looking at that through eternal scriptures and not through TikTok or through MSNBC or the New York Times? A biblical worldview can answer every question for you. When should I get married? Should I have children? What should I eat? How should I act? How should I vote? Should I care about my country? How should I treat other people? Where do I go when I die? Is there a hell? The Bible has an answer to all those things. A biblical worldview is a comprehensive way of looking at living. And yet, what I think is a willingness problem, it really is a courage issue, isn't it?
Fear.
So you have a really good way of looking at we have to either get our worldview from God or man. Can you
Yes.
riff on that a little bit?
And the consequence of the fear, I think pastors are fearful, and fearful comes from a lack of knowledge. Like I say, you hear a loud thud and you wake up in the middle of the night and you flip on the light, you see the cat knocked over the flowers. The knowledge drives away fear, and these folks don't know what to do. And let me just remember, 365 times in the scripture, one for every day of the year, it says, fear not. When Christ was walking on the water, his first words out of his mouth, fear not. So he has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Those are opposites, by the way. When you're fearful, you're weak. You can't love a person you're afraid of. When you're fearful, you don't think straight. And so this idea of not understanding what the solution is and what is the solution. When Moses was having a hard time, and you can imagine what it would be like, his father-in-law came to him and said, Moses, Lord and I were talking, and you're going to wear yourself out here, son. And what you need to do is you need to set up a government, federal, state, local government, put thousands, hundreds, and tens. And now there's 3 things that you should look for. I can't give you a course in government. You just need to have 3 things to know who to put there. Number 1, those that fear God. Now, there's only 2 choices. And the answer to every question, the first words out of your mouth, you can tell. How do you feel about abortion? It's, well, I think, or God says. Those are the only 2 options. And so the question is either you believe that man created God, or you believe that God created man. And every other question flows from that. That's the fork in the road. If you believe that man just got here on his own, he climbed up out of the primordial slime and said, let's write a symphony, then you believe that he can then decide what is right or wrong. He is his own standard. If you believe that God created man, then you believe that God has a standard. If you believe that man is his own standard, then you believe that man is basically good. By what standard would he not be good? If you believe that God has a standard, then you know that we're in need of a Savior. If you believe that man is basically good, then you believe that anything that goes wrong is not his fault, because he's good. So if a person comes in here and starts shooting someone, then you know that there's something wrong with that, but it can't be his fault because he's good. So whose fault is it? Well, it's got to be the gun's fault. Got to regulate that gun coming in here doing those nasty things. And if guns kill people, how does anyone ever get out of a gun show alive? By the way, nevertheless, but finally, here's the most important. If you believe that man got here on his own, then where do rights come from? And this is fundamental. They come from the group. They come from the tribe. So you hear people talk about women's rights, Hispanic rights, trans rights. You and I know our rights don't come from the group. Our rights come from God. And the difference is so when you listen to a politician, you listen to them for 60 seconds, they always are talking about these women's rights. There are no blonde, left-handed rights. There's only rights that come from God. And our founders started out. It's right there. We hold these truths to be self-evident, which is a gracious Jeffersonian way of saying any idiot ought to understand this, bozo. Be blind, deaf, and dumb. You ought to be able to say, this is self-evident, idiot, that all men are created equal, and are endowed by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court, are endowed by a majority, are endowed by their Creator. Now, wait. I mean, he was a deist. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Who's that? Jesus Christ, or the Word, or God, or Creator. They're synonyms. They're all the same. Man is endowed by Jesus Christ. Man is endowed by God. Man is endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those are life. You say, well, that's between a woman and a doctor, and I don't want government involved in bedroom. You're in the wrong country, honey, because it says in our birth that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of the United States government is to protect innocent life. Then liberty. Now notice the sequence. See, liberty is of precious little value if you're dead. So you have to have life first, then liberty, then sewer systems and overpasses. But the first thing you do is life. So you have and that will tell you 90% of all you ever need to know. As Dennis Prager says, you don't ask a person two questions. You ask a person where they stand on life, that'll tell you domestically. Ask them where they stand on Israel, and that'll tell you where they stand internationally. So our founders said our rights come from God for the purpose of the government to protect life, then liberty. I'll just give you an aside. When rights don't come from God, they come from the group. Every one of us is a minority. Our rights are not secure. Our daughters spent a year in Rwanda. 80% of the people in Rwanda are Hutu, 20% were Tutsi, 80% voted to kill the 20%. In the course of 90 days with machetes, they chopped 1 million people to pieces. That's democracy, by the way. When democracy, rights come from the majority. In America, you can vote 95-5 to kill Jews. You can't do it. Why? Our rights don't come from the majority, they come from God, and why? They give life. So every Jew knew that they could be chased from all over the planet. If they get under the canopy of protection of the American flag, they would be safe. That's why this nation has been the blessing to the entire rest of the world. So that battle, and who is going to explain that? Who should explain that? Who can? Only God's leaders, only the people in the pulpit, the church is the one that has to explain why that is. Now, let me just get back and clean up the democracy thing. We use the term democracy. Many members of Congress are not that involved intellectually, and so therefore they misuse the term. And that is, we democratically elect people to run the republic. But our rights don't come from the folks. Our rights don't come from the majority. The word democracy, by the way, does not appear in any of our founding documents, nor any of the constitutions of the 50 states, because our rights do not come from the majority. Our rights come from God.
And when it's mentioned in the Federalist Papers, it's incredibly negative. They're attacking the idea of democracy.
It's called a mob.
I was on Tim Pool's program last week, and I was like, yeah, I think democracy is a bad idea. And, oh my goodness, the media lost their mind because they think all of a sudden that means I'm pro-authoritarian, which I'm not. There's other forms of representative government other than democracy, such as a constitutional republic, which we actually have, not a democracy. And just to zero in on the very important point, a republic is built on eternal truths that do not change based on emotions, needs, wants, or desires. That's the idea of a republic. It's built on things that will always be true. The preamble of the United States Constitution is eternally applicable to human beings. Democracies change all the time. France, they redo a constitution every afternoon. It's not a joke. I mean, nothing sticks. It's not stable. The founding fathers are able to build one structure that lasts. It's because they were classically trained. They knew their Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But most importantly, they knew their scriptures. So they knew not just practical knowledge, but they knew eternal knowledge. Eternal knowledge is wisdom, the knowledge of things that do not change. How do human beings act? Who deserves power? How long should they have power? These are things that they built a system around, which is why the Constitution is the longest lasting political document centered around consent to the governed in the history of the planet. Nothing has ever lasted as long, and that's a big deal. When something lasts long, we should not try to discard it like the university maniacs try to. We should appreciate it and study it and ask the question, why? I always get a kick when people say, well, Charlie, are you trying to tell me, you believe the Bible is the Word of God? It's 2,000 years old. They mean that as an insult, which is, actually a red herring. It doesn't matter how old it is, but I actually think it's in our favor. The fact that it's so old and that we still study it means that it's probably true. It means that every generation of the smartest people have had a chance to nitpick this thing, and it still lasts and it gains in popularity. That every generation has a chance to poke holes in it, to cross-examine it, to tell us why it's wrong, and it only gets stronger, and it's in more languages and more continents and read by more people. That means that that thing is probably something you should study and that it's true. It's the opposite of what they're saying. So let's just focus on that. I want to close with this, and then we'll do some questions. I want to give a little bit more time for questions tonight than we typically do, because I think it'll be fun. Talk about how the founders cared about the Bible, why the Bible matters, and how our country is based on biblical principles.
It has to be based on only one of two things. It's either based on man's idea or it's based on God's idea. And they'd read the scriptures and they based it on God's idea. Now you say, well, America is not perfect. Let me just tell you, America is more perfect than any place you've ever seen. And every time someone wants to complain, particularly Democrats, who want to complain about an error that America took place in America, it's not the fault of the United States. It's the fault of their decision that they were the ones that wanted. So in July 4th, 1776, prior to that time, slavery was ubiquitous. It was throughout history until one day, 56 Americans in the Declaration of Independence said, from this day forward, our rights come from God, not from the property that you own, not your bloodline, not because of how much money you have, but because God made you. And from that, slavery then became anathema. And it's taken a hard time to try to get rid of it all, and it keeps popping up here and there. And there were some folks that rights come from the group, and they wanted to deny it. And so they continue slavery and deny freedom. And so they fought. America had to get rid of it. And then they came back with Jim Crow, and they talked about how that America wouldn't let blacks sit in the front of the bus. That's not true. Americans didn't do any such thing. Democrats did. You want to talk about Rosa Parks? Rosa Parks that bus company was the National City Bus Company from Chicago, Illinois. Ran buses in 38 cities in 16 states. They wouldn't mistreat their customers. But the city council in Alabama said that if a white person got on and there weren't any seats, that they had to stand up and let them sit down. And Rosa Parks said, now, in America, I don't have to do that. So all they had to do was take it and go to court. And they said, you can't treat anybody like that. Now, it happened one time when those Democrats did that, but that's not America, and yet the average teenager is told that that's the way America treated them. No, we didn't. That's the way you did it, brother. And that's we had to fight a war, and you're still trying to get people identified, even little kids trying to identify them based upon their skin color because they think rights come from the group. And we do not believe rights come from the group. We believe that rights come from God. So that was the fundamental difference, and it continues to fight to this day.
Beautifully said. Let's start lining up for some questions, everybody. Bob is a wealth of knowledge, I got to tell you, and he's just barely touching on what he learned when he was in Congress. You know, there's some very good members of Congress. Senator Josh Hawley, who I'm trying to get here for a Freedom Night, by the way. He has a new book coming out on masculinity. We're going to get that done. Senator Rand Paul is great. There's some really good members. But what percentage of members of Congress do you think intellectually grasp what we just talked about as people are lining up for questions, either side?
I think most Republicans do. I really do.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think they say it. I don't think they actually could do what we're doing right now.
Well, that's a possibility.
But that's just me.
I will say this about you, Charlie. Very few people can do what you do.
Well, no, that's
and
anybody can. You just have to work at it. So. All right, we'll start over there with a Pfizer shirt. Well, it's not really a Pfizer shirt. It's a Freedom shirt.
It says Freedom, but it has a P. This is the Pfizer logo. It's cool, yeah.
You guys can line up on either side. We're going to take some extra time for questions.
I don't know how I got first in line. You guys got to line up. Come on. So my question is, how many years would you think it takes to get enough wisdom to start understanding spiritual and real, that topic you were talking about?
Okay, so there's a couple different ways to get wisdom. You can get wisdom through life experience, and you will get wisdom through life experience. However, that is not the only way to get wisdom. The first and most important way to get wisdom is to fear God. The Bible says that wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord. There's no wisdom on American college campuses because there's no God on American college campuses. That's why they say men give birth. And so if you're curious about pursuing eternal knowledge, then you need to get serious about studying. 2 hours a day, turn your phone off. I do at least 3 hours a day. Reading, podcasting, listening to lectures, Hillsdale online courses, studying the 400 hours of Dennis Prager teaching the first 5 books of Moses. If you want to go to sleep, listen to Dennis Prager talk about teaching Leviticus. I'm half kidding. It's not him. It's just tough. When you get to Leviticus 17 and they're talking about a ritual of killing a lamb, you're like, wow, this is, it's impressive he's able to make it as interesting as he is. But it takes work, because all of a sudden the distractions of the world come in. I could be doing this or I could be doing that. And, we host 3 hours of radio every day. I have to keep up on the news, but you get what you point at. We're aiming creatures. It's one thing Jordan Peterson gets right. And the Bible is correct. You ask and you shall receive, but you got to work at it. So if you want to be wise, then you read people that are wiser than you, that are no longer living, that have published something 100+ years before. If it's still around and still popular, you might say, well, Charlie, what is that? Do you know who Thomas Aquinas is? If not, you should get to know it. Read the Summa Theologica. It will change your life. Every Christian should read it. It's the greatest defense for the existence of God. Read your Aristotle, your Plato. You do not have to go to college to know this. In fact, it works in your favor. You have not gone to college.
Absolutely.
I didn't go to college because I have no deprogramming to have to go through to be able to learn these things. And then learn about the founding fathers, learn about your nation, learn about economics. Oh my goodness, you could spend a decade reading Thomas Sowell. If every American read Thomas Sowell, we would be a freer and a better country. And if you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, he will infinitely bless you with his ability to diagnose economic problems. So you can get wisdom at a young age. And then the truly wise person does not tell you what they know, but they ask the right questions. And so that would be what I would say. What's your response?
It's an excellent question. It's the perfect answer. And right at the tail end, you ask silly questions, you get silly answers. You ask mediocre questions, you get mediocre. Ask profound questions, you get profound answers. And that is a profound question. Wisdom only comes from two sources. It comes from experience. So that's why it's impossible for a young person to have the wisdom of an older person. But there's some things we've never experienced before. So the scripture says, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally, and he doesn't scold us for asking. And so that's what our founders did. And so you see, they worked for several weeks. They could agree upon absolutely nothing. They began to break apart. And then Benjamin Franklin, a sponsor of the first awakening, and a man who stood up and spoke spontaneously and used 14 scriptural references off the top of his head. You never hear anything about Thomas Jefferson, promiscuity, or all this other nonsense prior to World War I, when they began to deconstruct our founders. But when he began to say, he saw the thing was falling apart, and he asked to speak for the first time, one of only 4 people that had been in the same room 11 years earlier when they signed the Declaration of Independence. Now they're trying to write the Constitution, and it's not working well because 50% of the people lived in 3 states, 50% of the people lived in 10 states. Now there's no way around that. And so he said, I'm an old man. But one thing I've learned is that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall without his notice, is it probable that an empire could rise without his aid? He said, we've been instructed in the sacred writings, except the Lord build the house. They labor in vain that build it. Well, I believe this, that we shall be no more successful in this political building without his aid than were the builders of battle. He said, in the battle with Great Britain, we had daily prayer in this room. Our prayers were heard, and they were graciously answered. And then, this isn't 200 years later, this is 11 years later. He said, have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need him? And so then he goes on and says some more things. You can look it up, June 28, 1787. You get the whole speech. He said, I move that we recess for fasting and prayer. And let us see what God might do. And so they did. They met back on their knees the following day. Then they put together, in the next 7.5 weeks, the Constitution of the United States, the oldest government on the planet. Every government has changed repeatedly since that time. And they said, we need to let those people understand where this came from. He said, the wisdom didn't come from us, it came from God. Therefore, Congress shall never meet without first calling upon God in prayer. And it's never met without doing that. And then where does our rights come from? Either from what you say or what I say or what God says. Therefore, whether it be dog catcher or president of the United States, in order to have a position of public trust in America, you must first swear allegiance on the Bible. Then, to remind folks as to where America is, why it's different, this 4% that's blessed the entire world, why every official document, every law, every presidential proclamation, when you're all finished, it says, I want to remind you the 2 times that the world changed. Number 1, in the year of our Lord, the 2023rd, and of the independence of the United States, the 242nd. That's to remind people that's when things changed, and that's the source of our wisdom.
Thank you.
Hi, Charlie. On any money or anything we have, it says, in God we trust. Our founders trusted in God. Everyone trusted in God back then. But now, 37% of the people in America don't trust God. And they don't believe. Some of them are just, most of them are trans. And
Not most, but we're trending in that direction. Give it a couple years.
yeah. But anyway, how do we get America back to the way it was?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my answer is going to be challenging to some people, because I think one of the big issues has been the overemphasis on the macro. And I'm big on macro. I do a whole radio show on macro. But there's a reason why the self-improvement types are more popular than ever right now. It's because those of us that have a Christian conservative worldview, our whole metaphysics, of course, is macro. Jesus is going to come and he's going to retake his throne. However, I'm afraid that at times we abdicate how important our micro actions are. Getting married, having children, building businesses, giving back charitably. I do not know how to save the macro in the short term. They have captured every major institution. You better believe I'm going to dedicate my entire life to building either new institutions or taking back these institutions. I will not forget that. But I also, what is liberating for me is believing that, yes, God is in charge, but also that out of love of God and obedience to God, my micro actions really matter. That I'm going to keep on showing up even though I don't know if it's going to yield the result I want. And so, Martin Luther had a terrific quote. He said, even if the world was ending today, I would plant an apple tree. Which means that you should do things that are going to yield fruit beyond your life today, even though things do not look good on the nightly news. And so I have no idea how to save the macro. There's a satanic force that is going through our country. The church needs to be part of the solution. But I do know confidently that millions of people committing to micro action is one of our greatest hopes. I really believe that. Because the opposite I'm seeing to start to happen, and this is not a small thing. I have a human laboratory as I run my radio program. And we get thousands of emails. If anyone watches on Real America's Voice, yeah, well, thank you guys you guys are amazing. My favorite listeners are on Real America's Voice. They're hyper engaged, incredibly patriotic, and very opinionated. Incredibly opinionated. And so we got thousands of emails the other day where I said, okay, for those of you over the age of 50, do you think people should have children today? And I would say about 10% would say no. And these are Christian conservatives. And it's not because of a biblical reason. They said, no, the world is so dark, it's so terrible, it's unloving to bring kids into this world. That's an evil thing to believe. Let me just be very clear. That is an evil thing to say, I am not going to be fruitful and multiply because I don't like the headline on CNN. And so that there is a disturbing, cynical reaction that we have to stop. It is a sin to despair, as Dennis Prager said. And you have to do righteous and virtuous things daily, regardless, and leave the macro to God. It will make you happier. You can release yourself, but at least you can know that your own micro-obedient action is in alignment with how God wants you to live. You have something you want to add to that?
That's the answer. I would only add this, that we're responsible for the depth of our ministry. The Lord is responsible for the breadth. So we do what he called us to do, and we can't always see it. The Apostle Paul was sitting in prison. The churches look to be like they're all falling apart. And he says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the work. Finished, son. It looks to me like you barely got started. Things chaos is here. No, he had done what God had called him to do. And you have reason, well, look how terrible everything is. Rome is turning against me, and I'm in prison. Why is he in prison? The scripture says Paul planted, Apollos watered, and the Lord gave the increase. That means Apollos traveled with him, was a part of. You can't tell me one thing that Apollos ever said or did. Why? Because he was never put in jail. And when Paul was put in jail, now we know what he would have said to the Galatians, what he would have said to the Thessalonians, what he would have said to the Corinthians. It was God's plan to tie him down to do that. And yet he said, I decide whatever state I am there with to be content. I'm not going to question God. So in this battle of doing things, we're responsible to do what he called us to do. And we can't be looking out look at how terrible everything is over here. No, we do what he called us. The Lord was on the cross. On the cross. He spent 3 years with his best buddies, his friends. Not even they showed up. He's all by himself. And what did he say? It is finished. He's finished. Nobody's here. Your mother, that doesn't count. I mean, no, he had done what God had called him to do. And that's our responsibility, is to be faithful to him. And then God uses it the way we should be. And don't ever allow Satan to use the waves to focus. My father had on our mirror in our bathroom growing up, obstacles are what we see when we take our eyes off Christ. And when you don't look at him, you start looking at the water and you say, look at what's happening. Look what the school board's doing over here. Look what's happening. That'll wear you out. Keep your eyes on him. Do what he called you to do. He'll handle the rest.
And remember, Jesus went to the cross obediently, not willingly. Your will, not my will. Thank you. You bet. Great question.
On your lead into micro solutions, I just wanted to ask a question. Did you hear about Jack Hibbs' announcement on YouTube Monday night that they got the school board to agree to an ordinance that parents would be notified if their child asked for any psychological counseling or any trans worries, in complete opposition to what the state legislature would not allow? So can you replicate that? You said you're macro, but that's a micro example.
Yeah, I
Good
mean,
news.
look, we have a lot going on, but I'm telling you, all of us together, we have to combine our forces. Turning Point Action is the place to do this, to take back the Scottsdale Unified School District Board. It's long past time. You know, many of those people need to be fired. And look, you could tell by the scant applause, there's just not a lot of engagement in that. We've tried, but is that your question? Or, okay. You know, in certain areas, the school board issue is really hot. It was hot here, but honestly, it's been really hard to rally people behind it, even though the head of the Scottsdale School Board has said some of those vicious anti-white stuff you could imagine. And I could look at it. So I hope we can get people engaged and involved. We have a deeper Arizona political problem right now, which is I'm seeing more cynicism than I've ever seen in any political climate by doing this in 11 years. It's a major problem. We have so many great patriots that are telling me, I'm never going to vote, I'm never going to be engaged, everything's broken, everything's terrible. We got to fix it. Yeah. And I think it's an understandable sentiment post the Kerry Lake debacle, but it's not a proper attitude to have, because that is wrong. So that's a side note, but I'm really worried, I'm concerned if we don't sort that out sometime soon. So, but yeah, Jack Hibbs is the man. Thank you for mentioning that. So, all right.
Hi, Charlie. Why do Democrats erase certain parts of history?
I didn't hear it.
It was addressed to me, but the question was, why does the left erase some parts of history?
Well, probably embarrassed, for one thing. They want to have a corporate responsibility. They want to blame everybody for what they did. And America was founded to be a lighthouse for the gospel, and it's been so. Has everybody been perfect? No. It was there to end slavery and to help the poor. Do we still have poor and had a fight? Yes. But America as a unit stands for righteousness. There are those that want to tear it down, and the second they walk in, I mean, they just 5 or 6 years ago, New York was the safest major city in the world. Those folks come in the very first day. They turn out and say that if you want to urinate on the sidewalk, we won't arrest you. If you want to jump the turnstile and sleep in the subway all 24 hours a day, you can do it. And they immediately turn the place into a mess, and then they want to blame the country for what they did. So that's what the left does for a living. They never run for office and say, didn't we do a great job in the Chicago school district? Didn't we do a really wonderful job making California a wonderful place? The only way they run for office is they attack their opponents. They call them names. And when Gavin Newsom was up for re-election, he took $136 million. He targeted one opponent and called him every name in the world and made between them. He was mayor of San Francisco. He was lieutenant governor of the state. He was governor of the state. You think in there someplace there would have been one thing he'd been proud of. Nope, he couldn't find one thing that he was proud of.
Yeah, and I mean, history is a teacher. And American history, properly understood, should make you very thankful. The left has to make sure the citizenry is ungrateful. The left is filled with ungrateful people. Ingratitude drives resentment, and resentment is the life force of the American left. They are driven by resentment. So history properly understood stifles resentment. It makes you proud. It makes you happy. It makes you thankful for the exceptional nature. When you realize how rare it is to have self-government, to understand the brilliance of the founders, to understand how this was able to come together. This is why one of the reasons why I can't stand when people, overly complain about their circumstances in America. You might be going through something tough, but the biggest battle you have is with your own nature every single day. Resentment will destroy you from within. As a Christian, you're not allowed to be resentful. You have to be the opposite of resentful. You have to be hopeful. You have to be thankful. And so if they properly taught history, we would have a nation that would be filled with gratitude, and that would make them less powerful. Thank you.
That's great. That's great.
Hello. As a fourth-generation Arizonan and having a family that has worked for towards the infrastructure of Arizona, I've had teachers in my family, APS workers. My mother worked for the courts for quite a while, and they are Democratic. They are registered Democratic voters. I myself am an independent. I don't like to mix church and state, but Freedom Night is about talking about my freedom. So I am pummeled in my neighborhood by my neighbors, and my father has been there since 1985, and we are being treated like third-class citizens, and it's kind of been a nightmare, with upside-down flags flying in every direction, and me trying to just talk in my backyard to my sponsor, who recently passed away. She was my recovery sponsor, and she was, registered Democrat. And what do you think could be done about possibly like spiritual tactical measures implemented into maybe cybersecurity and as well as security in our neighborhoods for freedom of speech? What do you think can be done in a state like Arizona that, they don't want to admit it's, going to be a purple state? I believe in a purple state. I call it purple state because the balance.
Are you grasping the question, Bob?
No.
You covered a lot of ground there. I want to compliment you for that. Can you just summarize the question in 10 seconds or less?
Yes. What can be done for security measures in cybersecurity?
Okay. Sure. So, look, the Arizona legislature needs to come together. I believe federally we're at risk of a massive EMP attack in our country, and no one wants to talk about how we are vulnerable to an electromagnetic pulse. We allow balloons to fly over. They very well could have dropped an EMP that would have impoverished America. That's a separate issue. But yeah, you want to talk about the vulnerabilities in American critical infrastructure? Our leaders are more interested in sending hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine when we have legitimate cybersecurity flaws that could be exploited by the Chinese almost any day here. You might have different opinions than me on the Ukraine issue. That's fine. I think we can all agree that we should invest in our own cybersecurity and our own infrastructure before what's going on abroad. Thank you very much.
Hey, Charlie. I'm wanting to know, after tonight, I'm definitely going to be considering this as my home church after what you said. I've been here before, but definitely gonna, call it home now. But for people in my family or friends that don't call this type of a church home, where their pastors are willing to stand up against COVID mandates and things like that, how best might I advise them, or when I'm a guest at those churches with them, how best do we go about those scenarios? Because it almost seems like better to put them on a spot on a church day, or it might be better, private conversations, and they both have their place. But like what?
Yeah, I would try to do it privately. I would ask questions, right? And the best question is, hey, has the pastor mentioned anything in the last year that helps you make sense of the news? And you say no, right? Yeah, that's the answer to the question. 99% of pastors, not 99%, let's just say 90% of American pastors will not offer or bless their flock with the understanding of how to make sense of the news. That's a simple way to actually say something a lot deeper. That's why Dream City is growing. That's why Jack Hibbs is growing. You have to do it from a biblical perspective, obviously. But if you want to know one of the major drivers of people's interest, their anxieties, especially believers, they flip on the radio, listen to podcasts, they listen to Spotify, they're listening to something, they're hearing things that are confusing, and they're begging their pastor to help them understand it. And their pastor is unwilling. And you can have your own theological twist on it, right? But say something. And this is what just drives me nuts. Can I ask you another question, if that's okay? Ask your family members, hey, did your pastor mention or celebrate the reversal of Roe versus Wade last summer? Did you guys fast and pray for many days for the amazing intervention of God, thanks to the multiple decades of Christian activism, and now millions of babies' lives are going to be saved? I'm not going to put you on the spot. If the answer is no, you should leave that church. It's that simple. This was an act of the divine coming in to save millions of babies' lives. And I can't get a whisper out of most churches. A whisper. I was with a group of Christians. I said, how many of your pastors say that? And probably 5 hands out of about 300 went up. So let's take that. 500 out of 300 pastors mentioned, hey, Roe versus Wade repealed, good thing. So God blesses the nation and we ignore him. Thanks for your question. And just to add on to that point, people say, Charlie, when is God going to intervene? He intervenes. We just don't even dare to celebrate when he does most of the time.
Hey, Charlie, thank you for what you do. Thank you, Congressman. I have 2 questions. Can I ask both or just one?
Go as quick as you can.
Okay. I'm thinking that immigrants, those who are just coming from countries where there's a lot of war, could probably be the biggest supporters of what you're doing. I'm wondering, what are you doing to help encourage them to join the fight that you're in? And I speak as one of them. I'm from a country where there's war. And
Where are you from?
Cameroon. Yeah. And my country branded me a
Welcome
terrorist.
to America.
Thank you.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you. So seeing everything that's going on, personally, I'm appalled because this is not what we saw or hoped for or dreamed of. So I'm wondering, as an immigrant, or what can we do to join that fight?
Let me just say, this makes me so emotional. We just finished a Turning Point USA tour. And what's your name again? I'm sorry?
Ishmael.
Ishmael. It's a powerful name. And what Ishmael has said here is very important. And I hear it. When we did our event in Chicago, I had 3 first-generation immigrants from 3 different parts of the world, Vietnam, Honduras, and from Africa. And they said, Charlie, I didn't come here for this. Why are you guys doing this to yourself? And I don't know how to answer that. What we're getting right now from Ishmael tonight is saying, guys, why are you committing suicide? We need people like you, man, and I hope that people will listen, because maybe you who know actually what a war-torn, dysfunctional country, I don't mean to insult your home country, but it's dysfunctional, right? And I think you would agree. What that is. This is a great place. And we have people that come here and say, you know what, it's actually pretty awesome. And we have to be told by liberals that it's crummy. I trust you a lot more than a university professor about how great America is. You have something to add to that? No. What was your second question, Ishmael?
You said that the Bible is comprehensive and it answers all of our questions. I agree 1,000%. I want to ask this question this way, and it's not just for me. Now, we believe as Christians that Jesus is the answer. But here's the question. If Jesus Christ is the answer, then what does that answer look like when you're talking to someone who's a trans?
Who's trans. Okay, good. So Jesus is the truth. So you need to tell them the truth. Jesus does not want somebody to live in torment, ever. And so if somebody is trans and they're living in torment, we should have a heart to try to get them out of torment. These are people that are struggling. We need to understand that. These are people that are under a delusion. Now, the Christian approach to mental health and psychology for schizophrenia, for anorexia, should be the same that we have for transgenderism. So let's do a thought experiment. Is it loving? Is it the Christ-like thing if you're a doctor and an anorexic patient comes to you and she says, I want liposuction. So anorexic, she thinks she's fat, but she's vastly underweight. And she says, I want a procedure right now to suck the fat out of me. No, the doctor would be abusing that patient. But that patient is living under a mental delusion. So do you indulge in the mental delusion, or do you love the patient enough to say, I'm sorry, sweetie, you're living a lie, and I care for you too much to not give you what you think you want? In the trans setting, the person comes in, they say, I think I'm a woman. The doctor needs to be able to say, I love you enough to not give you what you think you want. You see, the Christ-like way to deal with someone with trans is understanding that the torment does not have to be permanent. We know this from the unbelievable amount of detransitioners and people that are now speaking out, like Ollie London and Chloe Cole, of people that have left the transgender delusion and have come back into biological reality and alignment. These people are suffering. They're suffering from a social contagion. And the way we love them is to make them no longer believe the lie. Thank you.
No.
This will be the final question. Ishmael, God bless you, man. I wish most Americans loved America as much as you love America. I mean that. This will be the final question over here.
Okay. Hi, Mr. Bob. I've known you since the 80s. I followed you and met you through Scott and MJ Michaels. I've always wondering when you're going to run for president. But you mentioned it briefly, both of you. We know that readers are leaders. So what would you recommend top 5 books everyone should read to be a wiser person?
No, you go first. We'll do one at a time.
Top 5 books for a wiser person. Okay. I was able to read 37 books last year, which was not as much as I wanted to read. But obviously the Bible. I will reemphasize Dennis Prager's Rational Bible. I think it's very important. I think it's absolutely terrific. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. If you're a Christian, it will make that book even more powerful. Viktor Frankl is the author of Logotherapy. He was in a concentration camp. One of the greatest authors, I think, of the 20th century. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. If you read it, at the end you'll say, thank you, God, for having Charlie say that. It will bless your life. Number 2, anything that C.S. Lewis wrote, but especially Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest books ever written. It's short, it's prophetic, it's deep, it is so profound. It's called Abolition of Man. Also, the Screw Tape Letters are great. Mere Christianity is fabulous. Anything by C.S. Lewis, whenever you are looking for it. Number 3, Disparities and Discrimination by Thomas Sowell. It's the greatest refutation to the anti-racism BLM lie that we are living through by Thomas Sowell. Number 4, let me think about this. I actually had a real, okay. Number 4 is a good one. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I want to give you an R-rated warning. Aldous Huxley was a contemporary of George Orwell. We often talk about how things are Orwellian. I want us to start talking about how things are Huxleyan. Aldous Huxley predicted the downfall of sexual norms and the erosion of the Western family, more prophetically in fictional form. If you are familiar with 1984 by George Orwell, great. You will be very moved by Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where it's all about what could drugs do if you just want to numb yourself? How could the state use technology to destroy your humanity? And then finally, the last book. What would be the best book to recommend for the times of today? Talked about Frankl, talked about C.S. Lewis. You know, I would have to say anything by Churchill, but especially a book about Churchill that I like. Larry Arnn's book, Churchill's Trial, and I think that's a really, really important book. I think Winston Churchill was the greatest man of the 20th century. Why? Because everyone talked about how flawed he was till he saved Western civilization.
Sure.
You know, we have nobody like that in America, right? Obviously.
Yep.
Churchill's Trial by Larry Arnn. He was the only alpha male left willing to actually save the West. There's a beautiful part in the book where, you could tell this story better than I could, Bob, with the imagery, but there was a crisis of confidence of Neville Chamberlain, and I think it was the Queen. It might have been the King at the time. I think it was the King. Wanted to see Winston Churchill. Remember, Churchill was in total, he was in isolation and scandal because of the Darnells. And Churchill was called by the king to, hey, come over here to help me figure out who the next prime minister is going to be. And he said, what? At that moment, I felt the weight of the world coming upon my shoulders because I knew I was the only man up to the job. If you think he was cocky, he was, but he earned it. He saved the West, and he's got something to learn from that. Those are 5 books I recommend.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely excellent. And after he was given the seals of power, he said he went home and slept the sleep of a newborn babe, content in the knowledge that finally someone was in charge and knew what they were doing. but let us just close with that situation. In the 1930s, everything that they did was wrong. If you could have prevented 55 million people dying, and yet all of that mistake after mistake after mistake, until finally on May 10th, Friday morning, Hitler rolls into France. Now France is gone, and now all of Europe is gone, and only Britain is there alone. And that 2 o'clock that afternoon is when the king invites Churchill over and says, Winston, how would you like to be prime minister? Well, big hairy deal. Everything's done now. But then 1940, 1941, 1942, 1943, it wasn't until June of 1944 that the Americans showed up, and they landed at Normandy, and they started to march. Now, let me take the context of that just a bit. That is that when we see what's been going on around here, for a long time, for the last 30 years, we've seen our educational system be stolen. Most of us remember when we had small schools. All during the 1970s and 80s had consolidation. So they did away with the local schools, and then they began to get teachers that now don't have an appreciation for where we are. There's been an awakening that's taken a place just at the last few moments. You say, but look at all the badness that's taken place. Now people are beginning to be concerned who's on the school board, and we've wanted to take the money away from the bureaucracy and give it to the parents. Arizona, we've tried that for 30-some years. Every time they would just about do it, the labor unions would come in with hundreds of millions of dollars and they would defeat it. Till finally, 18 months ago or so, Arizona broke the logjam. Now there's 6 more states. 7 more states will do it over the north. And so I look at it this way, as to World War II. Nothing happened for a long time. Then things are another chaos, but then we started to make some steps. And that is we began to lose people. We lost 3,800 on the first day at Normandy. Then you begin to lose more and lose more. And if you just dropped out of the sky, and you can say, oh, isn't this terrible? Well, it is. But we're now awake. We're now 1/4 of the way to Berlin. Now we're halfway to Berlin. Now we're 3/4 of the way to Berlin. Now we're involved in a fight in which the church is beginning to awake. The communities are beginning to awake. We're now beginning to fight a bit when we were just laying there letting them roll over us for a long, long time. So in this battle, do not become weary with well-doing. That is that this, on our watch, we're not going to let it fall. I won't go through. I would just add one other thing that people are concerned about. What books? I enjoy history and biographies, and reading is my form of entertainment. I don't play golf. If I have a moment free, I'm going to read. That's my form of having a good time. But for those that want to say, why is America in a free enterprise, why is it blessed the world as it does? As I could just mention, there's a ship parking at this moment in Hong Kong and in Singapore using a global positioning system conceived, invented, and maintained by Americans. There are people that are ordering parts from all over the world using an internet conceived, invented, and maintained by Americans. There are skyscrapers all over the world because an American invented the elevator. This little 4% has done all of these things. Now, why? There's a book that's called The 5,000-Year Leap, and that is that Adam and Eve and Moses and Noah and Christ and George Washington, they all traveled the same way. But suddenly there's this leap that begins to take place in which all these things happen. It's called the 5,000-Year Leap. Each chapter is about 3 pages long, 2 to 3 pages. It's 28 principles of the United States. And if I were to recommend a person want to know, how do I understand what makes America different economically, that would be the book I'd recommend.
Thank you so much. Everybody, on May 3rd, we have Barry Maguire. You're not going to want to miss it. I want to encourage you, bring a friend who does not know the Lord. That's your homework assignment, okay? May 3rd, you have to bring a friend who does not know the Lord. It's going to be in your face in the best possible way. Barry Maguire, who I think is one of the best evangelists in America, May 3rd. Give it one last time up for Bob McEwen. God bless you guys and see you next month.
That was great. Thank you, sir.